Everybody doing all right today? Good. Good afternoon. I'm EJ Hammon. I am a true crime author, and I've been writing about Ted Bundy for over 20 years. He was just the serial killer that stuck with me, the first one that I ever really sat down and learned about, studied. And though I'm very interested in lust killers in general, he's just kind of a number one. When we think about serial killers, has anybody here not heard of Ted Bundy before? That's pretty much what I expected. He does tend to stand out in the world of serial killing as far as being different. He seems very different than a lot of killers. But today I really want to talk about the media manufactured facade that we see of Ted Bundy, as opposed to necessarily the real person that existed underneath all of that. Bundy had a very specifically styled personality that was very much what he wanted the world to see, and he very rarely stepped out from beneath it. The media, when he was arrested, and afterwards learned to use the media, they kind of played up a lot of factors based on, the fact he was clean-cut, educated, as opposed to necessarily the real person, and really focusing on the crimes and the harm that he caused in those crimes. And if you make it to the end of the presentation, I'll actually give you a couple of stories that I was told by former Leon County Sheriff Ken Katsaris. He was the Florida sheriff that took custody of Bundy in Tallahassee, Florida, after he'd been arrested for the final time. So go that direction. When you ask anybody in the world today to name the most famous serial killer, most people will name Bundy, at least one of their initial people that they mention. He really rose to prominence during his post-arrest. He was arrested in Utah, in Colorado, and in Florida, once. So he learned to really use the media to his betterment, to make him look better, as opposed to necessarily showing the monster that he truly was. What do we think of when we think of Ted Bundy? Can you name any words or any phrases that makes you think of Bundy? How he may have been perceived?
Maybe he was perceived as attractive in the media.
Very attractive, yes, absolutely, in the media. Definitely, yes.
He was perceived as charming.
Charming, absolutely. So most people looked at him, you can even watch some of the videos and they're looking at him and talking about, well, I just don't think he could have done it. He was just really, he really gave off this vibe of being somebody who could definitely not have committed these crimes. Even though he was raised in a middle-class family, he found a way to seem to appear to be, highly intelligent, probably appeared more intelligent than he truly was. He also was college educated, so he did have that going for him. He wasn't the most intelligent person in the world, but he wasn't, he wasn't low intelligence level either. He made pretty decent grades in college. He didn't do so great on his LSAT when he applied for law school, but he was still accepted. And again, he had the girlfriend who had the daughter. He seemed to be a family man. When we consider what he looked like, the fact that he wanted to enter politics, he seemed very normal to anybody who was just seeing him superficially. However, Bundy was haunted by something he referenced as the entity. We don't often hear a personification or a way to describe this inner darkness in someone, but he did kind of put off his responsibility for the crimes on what he called the entity. It really makes you think of the difference between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and this personification of the Mr. Hyde within, a way to blame his crimes on something other than himself. He really did want to distance himself from those crimes. It was really easy for people in and around Bundy after he'd been arrested to be charmed by him, to be manipulated by him. I actually asked the former sheriff, Ken Katsaris, what he thought of Bundy. Whether he was, fooled by his behavior, his manipulation. He said, I knew exactly who I had in my prison, but if I had not been to the autopsies of the two young women that were killed in Cayamega in Florida, if I had not been at the crime scenes in Tallahassee, I would have liked the guy. He came across as very, very earnest and very honest for the most part, not always. But he seemed like someone who was just genuinely a nice person, just got caught up in something. Of course, we know now that was not the reality in the least. He had some very deeply troubling paraphilias. Ted was a kleptomaniac. We don't talk a lot about Ted Bundy's thefts. He was, of course, we all know him for the killings, but we don't consider a lot of the other crimes that may have actually led him to those killings, made him comfortable with stepping over those lines beyond what the law allowed. He actually would steal anything from a nice TV, a rug. There's a scene in a movie about Bundy where he actually stole a ficus tree and was able, because he was driving a Volkswagen Bug with a open roof, he was able to put it in there, hanging out of the roof, and made his way with his tree in his vehicle. He was that bold. He was that comfortable with stealing. He actually stated, in those days, I wouldn't go into stores and shoplift. What I went for were the things that I couldn't afford, expensive things. He absolutely saw nothing wrong with stealing. He did not see it as intrinsically bad. He felt very entitled. We do see that with a lot of killers, with a lot of criminals. They feel very entitled to have what they wanted. He stole credit cards and made many purchases, and when he was on the run in Florida, he was able to steal credit cards to keep himself going, the money that he had when he escaped from prison the second time. He was so proficient at stealing cars, he stole several, some in Colorado, some in Florida. We know that as a juvenile, he actually was arrested for Grand Theft Auto. He was also arrested for theft another time as a juvenile. But he was never arrested as an adult for stealing. So he actually got so good at it that nobody, at least in the 70s, where they didn't have a great deal of cameras and knowledge of the way that people committed these acts. He was able to get away with it. Once he reached 18, his juvenile crimes were wiped. So there's really no record beyond just a couple of little cards in the police department, historical cards where they had written what the charges were. That was it. There was one case, and I believe it was when he stole, I think he stole electronics, and he actually was able to misdirect the employees of the store. They asked, where did Bundy, or where did the person go? And he said, oh, he went in that direction, not knowing that they were looking at the person that had stolen the electronic. He'd already had it in his car. I think it is crucial to understanding his psyche, understanding how easy it was for him to take these objects, because not only were the items in his care objects, but he considered people objects. So if he's stealing women, to him it was no different than stealing a vehicle or a plant or anything of that nature. And of course, once his victims were dead, he just used their bodies as his possessions and cast them aside in several different areas. Some of them were decapitated as well once he was finished with that. He did say the big payoff for me was actually possessing whatever it is I had stolen. It wasn't the act necessarily. Although, let's face it, he probably got some thrill out of it. And it extended into his abductions of women later. Ted Bundy had a sock fetish. A lot of people have fetishes. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, but I think that this speaks to his OCD nature. Bundy wanted to change his socks several times a day. He was very drawn to white socks. Just one of those cotton socks all the time. Even when he was in prison, he had them with him. He stated, socks are such a serious part of my life. They're so very important to me. And again, I think that comes back to the obsession, the possession of the items, the needing to make sure that he was as perfect as he could be. There's a movie that came out in 2002, it's called Bundy. And I like the movie, it's not the best acted movie, but it's got a lot of these really great facts, a lot of the details. They have a shot of his sock drawer at the very beginning. I wish I had my pictures, I would show you. But he did get very excited about socks. He said, I must have 6 or 7 pairs right here with me in my cell. That's how excited he got about socks. So even in prison, he was able to obtain those things that he considered very important to him. And again, we hear the word possession, where he talks about possession, just needing to have things. This may have been because he was not a wealthy person as a child. He was raised middle class, maybe didn't have everything he wanted. And with the entitlement, when we draw that into the personality here, then we're probably related. Peeping Tom. And what do we imagine when we conjure up the image of a peeping Tom? A lot of us will consider, a young boy that's maybe looking through windows who seems interested in, finding out something salacious in one of his neighbor's windows. However, instead of being a rite of passage, it's really more of an aberration, this type of behavior, this voyeurism, this need to see what other people are doing. Bundy was even drawn to listening to radio shows, the call-in programs, because he enjoyed being able to listen to people without them knowing that he was listening to them. So there was something very strange about this type of behavior. There is a trope that states that at one point Bundy was caught by a neighbor and they poured some water down on him while he was engaged in his self-manipulation. So I don't know if that's true. It is actually in the Bundy movie, again, with all the great details, that came out in 2002. And the definition of a peeping Tom's actions can be described as a disorder that involves achieving sexual arousal by observing an unsuspecting and non-consenting person who is undressing or unclothed and engaged in sexual activity. Behavior may conclude with masturbation by the voyeur. Of course, often this behavior can be fueled by pornography and can escalate to more dangerous behavior. And we will talk about that a little bit more as we go through. A lot of people who are voyeurs start to move into stealing items. They actually break into the home because just looking through the window is no longer as good. So Bundy would go in and steal undergarments, and that's where we start seeing him acting out as far as his initial crimes, where he would actually enter the home of his victims. That's how he started. And that's also what we see a reversion, where he was in Florida on the run, and he actually was breaking into homes at that point. So that seemed to be a regression at that point as well. Bundy readily admitted that he liked to creep around in the darkness, and from a young age he started sneaking out of the house. He did like to go through trash cans and see if he could find pornography that people had thrown away. 14 or 15-year-old. We do, as I mentioned, see a lot of this type of behavior in young criminals, Paul Bernardo being one. He was one of the Canadian serial killers, the Ken and Barbie murders that killed young girls. There was also another killer, Maryland-based, Jason Thomas Scott. He started peeping when he was only 10. He recorded a great deal of what he saw, and later evolved into breaking and entering and stealing before murdering at least 5 women in his community. Of course, you have to consider that a lot of people who understand this and their children may take them to therapy, may talk to them and see why this is such a compelling behavior for them. But in the time that Bundy was doing this in the 1950s, his mother would not have considered taking him to a therapist. That just wasn't something that was done at that point. Also, Bundy was a stalker, which I think relates to his peeping Tom. He liked to follow his victims. It wasn't just about going and completing an act. Part of it was being able to follow them and engage with them from a distance before he actually would break into the home. Bundy did admit to an addiction to pornography. Many of you have seen the video that he did with the night before he was executed with Dr. Dobson. A couple of people have seen that. Yeah. He was, of course, if you've seen the interview, he was just trying to find something else to blame his behavior on. But he was very much caught up in pornography. He was also caught up in the detective magazines that showed women cowering, women that were fearful. And of course we see that that might have also been part of his inspiration as far as how he interacted with his victims. Of course, Ted came across there was an older neighbor who lived near them in Tacoma, Washington when he was young. He was in his late teens, early 20s. She was absolutely charmed by him. This older woman, she was an elderly person, would lend him her car. She would give him money. And she mentioned something to his mother at one point about Bundy maybe returning the money that he borrowed, and Louise Bundy, his mother, said, "Don't ever think you're going to get that money back. It's not coming back." So, he was able to just talk people into things very easily, regardless of the fact that he was absolutely, had so many paraphilias Bundy was a necrophile. That was something that it seemed that he enjoyed it more than the actual act of killing. In fact, he would knock his victims unconscious, and he didn't care whether they were dead or alive. He was going to commit the act, but as long as they weren't conscious, it didn't matter to him, one or the other way. He was, going to take what he was going to take, and he did not want them looking at him. He didn't want the women judging him. He would return to the bodies up to 2 weeks at a time after they had laid outside. Sometimes he would take the heads with him, and of course we can all imagine what was being done with them as well. Police did find several of the heads grouped together in one area, nowhere near where the bodies would have been, so no animal activity would have taken them that far away. So we know that that was occurring as well. Ted Bundy once said murder is not about lust and it's not about violence, it's about possession. So again, there's our word possession, about owning the women, about owning their bodies. And of course the sexual gratification, which makes him the perfect sexual offender. And so those are just some ways to consider. Bundy was not this educated man that was super intelligent. He wasn't somebody who was just misunderstood. He was actually a very brutal, violent killer who killed more than 30 women. Some people speculate as high as 100. He was able to actually name 20. They attached names to 20 of the known victims, and there were still 10 that they did not know what their names were. So, and then there are a whole bunch of unsolved cases that have been connected to him as well. And I did promise you a couple of stories about Ken Katsaris. So, Ken Katsaris was the former Leon County Sheriff. So that was in Tallahassee. And he was the individual who went to the autopsies and went to the crime scenes of the Kayamega murders and the attack at Dunwoody Street, which was right after that same night. And so he actually saw the bodies, he saw the crime scenes, and he is the gentleman who, has anybody seen Ted's public indictment? When he strolls out of the elevator? Okay, if you haven't seen it, it's fascinating. A lot of people had issues with Mr. Katsaris for making it public. Of course, that's not understanding that the media actually pushed the police department to do it publicly, or they would sue the police department. So Katsaris spoke to the judge, he spoke to the district attorney who said, look, it's your jail, go ahead and do it publicly. And so of course that's when we get to see this kind of seedier personality points and traits in Bundy. At that point we get to see the animal, the person that was really behind the mask. Now when Katsaris was watching Bundy, it had been several months, and the first cases were coming up, the Kayamega cases and the Dunwoody case. So Ted Bundy was being taken to Miami, so we're talking about Tallahassee, which is in the panhandle of Florida, the northern Florida, all the way down to Miami. And just before Bundy was to leave Tallahassee for the first time, Katsaris had to get him to the trial. The media heard about it and they staked themselves out outside the jail. They asked one of the officers when Bundy would be driven out of jail, when he'd be taken to the airport to go to Miami. And Katsaris sent word to the media that Bundy would be on his way the next morning. However, in truth, he was actually taken to the airport that night from the back of the jail, and Katsaris flew in a separate plane to get him there. The media camped out all night, and by the next morning, he asked an officer, just someone random, when Bundy would be brought out, only to be told he was already in Miami. So this was a way that Katsaris got to circumvent the media. He was also in charge of getting Bundy on that plane. So when he did so, for the safety of his officers, they actually chained Bundy to the floor in the plane. So he wasn't going anywhere. And apparently Ted asked him something along the lines of, Ken, what's going to happen to me if the plane goes down? And Katsaris told me, he kind of laughed and said, gee, Ted, I hadn't thought of that, and just walked out of the plane. It's certainly a situation that Bundy did not expect to see, find himself in at any point. So those are our little facts about that. Some trivia about Bundy. Did you know that Ted Bundy's Miami trial, the first of two, was the first televised criminal trial in the United States? That was the first ever case. We see it all the time, but that was absolutely the first one. So that's pretty cool. The Tallahassee Police Department, again, this is Katsaris as well, had to create leg chains that Bundy could wear that wouldn't be seen by a jury because the judge thought it would prejudice them. But he also had to find a way, because Bundy had already escaped twice from Colorado, to not actually be escaped. So Katsaris worked with a local orthopedic, and it actually resulted in a heavy spring-based set of chains called the Bundy brace that they actually still use today. So in order for the person to walk, they actually have to hold the chain because it's that difficult to move in it. But yeah, that was actually made for Bundy and still exists, so that's pretty interesting. Bundy was the first serial killer to be named so in history. So he's the reason that the term serial killer exists. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't other terms. Lustmörder was actually used in Germany for a while, meaning the same thing. But we had not actually here in the US separated spree killer, mass murderer, serial killer. So he was the first one that was effectively used, that they had that name used by the FBI. Bundy's Chi Omega case represents the first time bite mark evidence was used in court. So this will be a controversial, wait for it, okay. So Bundy's case was also the first time that a search warrant was ever used for a mouth to be used in court. So Bundy was, bite mark evidence is not used anymore, put it that way. So it's considered junk science. It sounds like you already know this. But Bundy left a double bite mark on one of his victims at the Chi Omega house. Has anybody seen it? Seen pictures of it? It's really gruesome, right? But he also had very distinctive teeth. So when Larry Simpson, he was the prosecutor of the first trial, Chi Omega, when he went to the Tallahassee Police Department, he flipped through some of the pictures and he was actually able to find this one picture that was taken of the bite mark with a ruler. And by getting several forensic dentists, they actually got together and made the cast of Bundy's mouth. It was Katsaris' actual dentist who did it. So the sheriff is taking Bundy into the dentist's office and having this cast made, and it matches so perfectly over. I don't think it could have necessarily worked for anybody else, but Bundy's teeth were so unique that I absolutely believe, first of all, we know because he confessed that he was the person that did it. But I think that evidence was valid, at least in his case. Again, I don't have any relation to any expertise in that, but you know, that was certainly something that was interesting about his case. Lastly, I just wanted to mention that I actually do run a blog for Bundy, bundyfile.com. I have some cards here. And I also am working on a book with my co-author out of France. It is involving several of the victims, 2 of the survivors in Florida, one of the young women who saved her friend next door from being killed in Florida. It's going to have some of the attorneys, some of the law enforcement, Katsaris is included, and it's also got one of the journalists that went to visit Bundy in Glenwood Springs. If you get a chance to watch Lucky Severson interview him, and his first name really is Lucky, it's very interesting just seeing that interview that he does there. So I've got the information here, and now let's just do like Q&A. Let's all talk about Bundy. So any questions or anything you want to speculate about or ask me about?
Most of his victims were older teen age, 20, 30.
Yes.
The last one was a young girl.
Yes.
Really.
12.
Has there been any speculation on why he changed all of a sudden to that?
Yes. Well, and I've also written about this too. She wasn't his first 12-year-old. He had actually killed another 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. I think that Bundy preferred older teenager and then 20-something women, but I think that he was not averse to engaging with somebody. One of the young women, she was 12, was hitchhiking. She just decided to skip school that day. She was in middle school. He picked her up. She did look a little bit older than 12, but they've never found her body. But I do think that Bundy sometimes slipped into that area of pedophilia. I really do think that it wasn't impossible for him to consider someone. I think the last victim, he was on the run, And I think he knew that someone so young was not going to fight back. So, yeah, absolutely.
I know, just from watching movies that have come out about him, they talked a lot about like police stations having to talk, in different
yes.
jurisdictions. Like, how do you think that played into everything, and when did they finally start talking to each other?
So they actually started talking after Bundy had been arrested in Utah, and then he was also suspected in murder in Colorado. And so there were several police departments that realized that their victims seemed very similar. First of all, the young woman in Utah that escaped. They were able to speculate on that, as well as the young woman that her body was actually found in Colorado because she was hidden under snow, and the snow preserved her body. So they were able to use that to essentially match him up. Plus, he gave his real first name at one of the crime scenes in Washington. So he gave enough away that I think they were able to pull up the details and start to link him to several crimes. Yes?
Yeah, this is my first time to hear anything about a sock fetish. Does this imply that he had like some kind of health or grooming obsession? In other words, he wanted socks for himself, or did he remove socks from victims that he raped?
So he wanted socks for himself. Bundy was he had a great deal of OCD. It was a very OCD behavior. Not just having to have the clean socks on all the time, but he also would, when police went into one of the rooms that he rented, he liked living in rooming houses. They actually went to his closet and found that every hanger was the exact space, the exact same distance between the others. That's how OCD he was, and had to be very in control of his life and the lives of others. Yeah.
I'd love to have broken into his apartment and stolen his socks.
Right. They would have been clean, that's for sure. Does anybody think that Bundy is too hyped up? Like, people talk about him too much as opposed to other killers, or?
He does overshadow most of them, but I never understood that.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a horrible guy.
There are a lot of
monsters out there that probably,
Absolutely.
Repulsive than he is.
Definitely.
It's weird to me that I'm almost 70, and it's weird to me that 30 years after this jerk dies, or whatever, is executed, that all these young girls are so in love with him now because
Very
of
much
Netflix and all that.
Right. And I guarantee they didn't consider, they didn't consider all the crimes that he committed and all of the people that he murdered, and he didn't talk to the survivors or their families,
Exactly.
And it's so easy to get wrapped up into this idea of Bundy, the way the media portrays him, this great-looking law student. He had so much going for him, and he did, but he also chose to commit these crimes, and he chose to follow that path, and that was really, he was absolutely responsible for that. So, but yeah, he does get a lot more media. Again, because he was perceived a certain way as opposed to who he necessarily was, in my opinion.
So they interviewed him when they were trying to catch the Green River.
Yes.
How much do you think Bundy actually helped with that investigation?
I don't think he had a lot to do as far as helping with the Green River Killer's identity. He did enlighten the police based on what his knowledge of going back to the crime scenes were. We know that Gary Ridgway went back to the crime scene, so he was correct about that. He was obsessed with the idea that police should set up a slasher film fest, and that he would be there. And I don't think police ever followed that line of thinking, but
it always kind of fascinated me how he said, well, he would talk in like a third person.
Third person. So that was from his interview between 1980 and 81, when he was visiting with the journalists Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, and what they were trying to do was get him to talk about the crimes, but he didn't want to. They'd said, "We'll write a book for you. We'll exonerate you if that's what we find to be true." And of course, Bundy, hemmed and hawed and didn't give him anything. And finally, Stephen Michaud said, "Look, you're a smart guy. You studied psychology. You had a bachelor's in psychology. So he said, well, how would you speculate that somebody would do this? And he said Bundy immediately picked up the tape recorder and ran with it. So it was as if he was bragging about it, but he didn't actually have to give any information. Nothing verifiable in his mind. But of course we know that he was talking about his own killings, and later his confessions matched up to a lot of it. But it is interesting just reading those books because you get that idea, that, you know, that personality, and just how skeezy he was, and just devious and sneaky, and yeah, definitely.
Even with the judge that sentenced him.
Mm-hmm. Judge Cowart, the first, the first one.
It just kind of amazed me how the judge was almost complimentary while he was.
Yeah, he did praise him. He said, I would have loved to have had you in my courtroom, which really, to me, invalidates the lives of the women that died. So we don't talk enough about the victims. We don't talk about their families, the survivors. I've been lucky enough to get to know one of the survivors really well, Kathy Kleiner. She was one of the young women at Coyote that made it. And just, she's still having issues with her jaw where he hit her with the, he actually used from a wood pile, one of the oaken logs, and just brutalized these women. They said, both Kathy and the sheriff told me that there was just bark all over the beds. You don't even think about how the bark would have fallen off of the, and blood everywhere, and just, you know, pantyhose were left in one of the victims' rooms, and just what chaos, and how their lives have never quite, you know, gotten back on track. The two young women that survived that were roommates, Kathy and Karen, they don't even talk anymore. So, you know, they don't have that connection. They both had very different experiences afterwards. One felt very isolated, the other felt very accepted by the sorority. So they're still not really in, not talking. And these are two women whose lives moved in, you know, they were rooming together in a sorority house. So, you know, it's very sad. But yeah, we don't talk enough about the victims.
Is there any idea where his daughter is these days? And how old she is? Any idea? She'd be like 30 or so now?
She would be probably 40. I think she was born in 81. Her name was, her birth name was Rose or Rosa, right. But she's had her name changed because after Bundy started confessing, and if you're not aware, he was married, married in 1980. After he started confessing, his wife left him because she had been convinced that he was actually innocent. And so that proved to her that he was not, and she and the daughter, she had the daughter's name changed as well as her own. So the last I heard, the daughter may be in the UK, but I can't confirm anything. If she doesn't want to be found, I certainly understand why she wouldn't want to be. Yeah.
And he has a brother as well, right? Doesn't Bundy have a
brother? Bundy has 2 brothers and 2 sisters.
Okay.
They were half siblings. And they were all adopted siblings too, because his stepfather adopted him.
Outside of like the impulses he had and, you know, the entitlement that he showed, like, was there any event in his childhood that like led him to be that way, or was he just, you know, the nature versus nurture, you know?
That's a great question. Bundy was raised in Philadelphia for the first 4 years of his life with his mother's father and mother and her 2 sisters. And his grandfather was very violent. He was schizophrenic. He would talk to himself very loudly. He would abuse neighborhood animals, abused the women in the household. So if you can imagine a young child being around that type of behavior, especially against women, you're talking about somebody that's getting very, you know, very violent images very young. There is a story that his aunt told that she woke up when he was about 3. She'd taken a nap, and she said that he had taken all the knives that he could find and just surrounded her entire body with them at 3. And so there was already something abnormal about him that you know, unfortunately probably would not have ever been treated, because they just weren't treating that back in those days. Other questions, concerns? Did anybody learn anything new today? Yeah?
Socks.
Good. Socks. Absolutely. Yep. Be careful with your socks. Awesome. Well, I'm just so glad. I'm glad that everybody made it. Thank you so much for coming. And I'll be here at my little booth at the very far end of the big room in there. But yeah, definitely reach out if you'd like to get information about my blog. I've got that information. I've got information about the upcoming book. we hope to have it out within the next few months, probably early 2022. So, yeah. All right, thank you for coming, guys.